A few years ago, I moved into a small rental house at the end of a dead-end street in Pennsylvania. It was one of those neighborhoods that looked quiet during the day, but after sunset it felt completely different. There were only 6 houses on the street, all spaced close together, with narrow driveways and old maple trees leaning over the road. At night, the branches would scrape against each other when the wind picked up, and the whole street would sound like it was whispering. I moved there alone after a breakup. I was 26, working from home, and honestly just wanted a place where nobody knew me. The rent was cheap, and the landlord told me the area was peaceful. At first, it really did feel that way. The first neighbor I noticed was the man who lived in the house directly across from me. He looked to be in his late 50s, maybe early 60s. Tall, very thin, always wearing the same tan jacket no matter what the weather was. The first time I saw him, he was standing behind the curtain in his front window, just barely visible through the gap. He wasn't doing anything obvious. He was just there. I remember looking up from carrying a box into my house and seeing his face between the curtains. I gave a polite little wave. He didn't wave back. He just slowly let the curtain fall shut. I figured he was just some weird old guy. That should have been the end of it. But after a week, I started noticing a pattern. Every night around 11, when I'd lock up and turn off the downstairs lights, I would glance out through the blinds, and he'd be there, standing in the same front window of his house, looking out. At first I thought maybe he just had insomnia. A lot of older people do. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. He wasn't looking at the street. He was looking directly at my house. I tested it one night. I moved from one side of my living room to the other without turning on any lights. His head shifted slowly with me. I froze. There's something uniquely unsettling about realizing that someone has been watching you long enough to follow your movements in the dark. I told myself maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I was the one being paranoid. A few days later, I was taking the trash out around 10:30 when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw him standing at the end of my driveway. I hadn't heard him approach. Up close, he looked even worse than I expected. Pale skin. Watery eyes. His lips looked dry and cracked, like he never drank enough water. He said, "You live alone?" Just like that. No hello. No introduction. I laughed awkwardly and said, Yeah? Just me." He kept staring at me. Then he asked, "Do you ever hear things in this neighborhood at night?" I remember the way he asked it. Not curious. More like he was checking whether I had. I said, "No. Not really." He nodded once, looked toward my house, and said, "That's good." Then he turned around and walked away. That was the first time I felt actual fear around him. The next morning, I bought cheap cameras online. While waiting for them to arrive, I started being more careful. I kept my doors locked all the time. I stopped going outside after dark. I even started sleeping with a kitchen knife beside my bed, which I know probably wouldn't have helped much if something really happened, but it made me feel slightly less helpless. 2 nights later, I woke up at around 2:14 a.m. to a noise downstairs. Not a loud crash. Just a soft little sound. Like a fingertip tapping glass. I sat up in bed and held my breath. Then I heard it again. Tap. 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 My bedroom was upstairs facing the backyard, so I couldn't see the front of the house. I grabbed my phone, turned off my screen brightness, and slowly crept to the hallway. The tapping continued, spaced out every few seconds. It was coming from the living room window. My heart was pounding so hard it felt painful. I stood at the top of the stairs for maybe 30 seconds, too afraid to move. Then the tapping stopped. The silence was almost worse. I went back into my room and locked the door, even though it was just one of those cheap indoor locks. I stayed awake until sunrise. In the morning, I checked outside. There were smudges on the front window. Long streaks, almost like someone had been pressing their fingers against the glass. That same day, my cameras arrived. I installed one on the porch, one over the driveway, and one in the backyard. That night, around 11:07, I got my first motion alert. The front camera showed the man from across the street standing at the edge of my lawn. He wasn't moving. He wasn't approaching the house. He was just standing there, staring directly at the front door. I watched the live feed from my phone for almost a full minute, too scared to even call someone. Then he slowly raised one hand and pointed toward the side of my house. Not at a window. Not at me. Just toward the narrow strip of darkness between my house and the next one. Then he turned and walked away. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I checked the side yard. There was nothing there. At least, not at first. Then I noticed the basement window screen had been bent outward. I called the police. When they came, they took a statement and checked around the property. One of them went down into the basement with a flashlight. He was down there for less than a minute before calling the other officer over. They found muddy footprints on the concrete floor. Someone had been in my basement. The screen on the small ground-level window had been pried open from the outside. The officer asked if I'd been down there recently. I hadn't. It was just storage. There was something else, too. One of the boxes in the back corner had been opened. Inside were old photo albums from my parents that I hadn't unpacked yet. The top album was lying open on the floor. The page it had been opened to was a family photo of me as a kid. The police searched the area but didn't find anyone. They asked me if I had problems with neighbors, so I told them about the old man across the street. When they went to speak with him, nobody answered the door. Later that afternoon, I saw an ambulance outside his house. I walked out onto my porch and one of the other neighbors, a woman named Denise, came over to me and lowered her voice. She said, "Did you hear?" I said, "Hear what?" She looked confused. "That man across from you. He died last winter." I actually laughed because I thought she was joking. I said, "No, he didn't. I've seen him almost every day." She just stared at me. Then she pointed toward the house. "That place has been empty since January. His daughter comes by once every couple weeks, but no one lives there." I felt my whole body go cold. I told her she had to be wrong. I described the man exactly. Her face changed when I did. She said very quietly, "That's him." That's when I noticed the workers loading things into the ambulance weren't paramedics. They were wearing pest control uniforms. Apparently the daughter had come by because neighbors complained about a smell in the house. The police ended up entering it later that day. They found signs that someone had been living there illegally. A mattress on the floor. Cans of food. Dirty clothes. And dozens, literally dozens, of printed photos of me. Walking to my car. Bringing groceries in. Taking out trash. Looking through my own front window. Some were taken from inside his house. Some were taken from much closer. What they never found was the person who took them. And the part that still bothers me the most is this. The front camera footage from that night, the night I saw the man standing on my lawn, was corrupted. Not deleted. Not missing. Just distorted. But for one single frame, right before the video broke apart into static, there was a face very close to the lens. It wasn't the old man's face. It was younger. And smiling. When I was 19, my parents rented a house in Arizona for one summer while my dad was working a temporary contract job. It was in one of those dry suburban neighborhoods where every yard was either dirt, gravel, or fake grass. The houses all looked almost identical, except for little details like a cracked mailbox or a faded front door. The backyard of our rental was surrounded by a tall wooden fence, but we shared the back section with the neighbor behind us. On the first day we moved in, my dad joked that the fence looked like it would collapse if someone sneezed near it. Our rear neighbor was a guy named Trent. He introduced himself the second afternoon we were there. He leaned over the back fence while my parents were unpacking patio chairs and said, "You folks settling in all right?" He looked normal enough. Early 40s. Baseball cap. Clean-shaven. Friendly smile. He even brought over a plate of cookies later that evening, which my mom thought was really kind. But there was something about him I didn't like. It wasn't one thing I could point to. Just a feeling. He had a habit of showing up whenever one of us was outside. If I went into the backyard to make a phone call, within 5 minutes I'd hear his voice from the other side of the fence. "Hot one today, huh?" If my mom watered the potted plants, there he was again. If my younger sister went out to read by the patio, he somehow always seemed to notice. At first it just seemed nosy. Then it started becoming creepy. One night my sister told me Trent knew her name even though she'd never spoken to him directly. She was 14 at the time and already uncomfortable around strangers. She said she had stepped outside to let our dog out, and Trent had called over the fence. "Hey, Emily, your dog almost got under the gate." None of us remembered ever telling him her name. My dad shrugged it off, saying he probably heard us talking. Then my mom found cigarette butts on our side of the backyard. None of us smoked. The butts were right below the shared fence, like someone had been standing on the other side and flicking them over. That same week, our dog started acting weird at night. He was an old lab, pretty lazy most of the time, but around 2 or 3 in the morning he'd growl low in his throat and stare at the sliding glass door leading to the yard. One night I got up to get water and saw him standing stiff by the door, hackles raised. I looked outside. At first I didn't see anything except the yard glowing faintly under the porch light. Then I noticed a shadow moving near the fence. A person. They ducked down the second I focused on them. I woke my dad up, and by the time he went outside with a flashlight, nobody was there. The next morning, there were footprints in the dirt near the fence. And right against the wood, there was a small knothole, one of those natural openings in warped boards. Only this one looked bigger than before. Like somebody had carved around it. That hole lined up almost perfectly with my sister's bedroom window. My dad finally had enough and confronted Trent. I didn't hear the whole conversation, but I heard enough through the kitchen window. My dad said, "Stay away from the fence, and stay away from my family." Trent laughed. Actually laughed. Then he said something like, "You don't own the view." After that, things escalated fast. The first really bad thing happened on a Friday night. My parents had gone out to dinner, and I was home watching TV with my sister. Around 9:30, the power in the living room suddenly cut out. Just that part of the house. The rest stayed on. A minute later, someone knocked on the back sliding door. 3 slow knocks. My sister jumped and looked at me. We both stared toward the dark glass. Then Trent's voice came through. "Everything okay in there?" I didn't answer. He knocked again. "I saw your lights go out." We stayed silent. Then I heard him try the handle. Very gently. Like he didn't want to make too much noise. I grabbed my dad's golf club from the coat closet and shouted that I was calling the police. The footsteps moved away from the door, and a few seconds later we heard the back gate creak. When my parents got home, they called the landlord and the police. The officer checked outside and found that the breaker panel on the side of the house had been opened. Someone had flipped the living room breaker. The panel was in the narrow space between our house and the fence, technically accessible from our yard, but close enough that someone could reach it from the top of the fence with the tool. Nothing came of it. No proof. 2 days later, my sister was in tears because she found a note tucked under her bedroom window screen. It said in messy handwriting, "You should smile more." My dad lost it after that. He went straight to Trent's house and pounded on the door. Nobody answered. But there was a TV on inside, and my dad swore he saw the curtain move. That night, we all slept in the living room with the dog. At around 1:15 a.m., the dog started barking like crazy. My dad ran to the backyard with a flashlight. He shouted for my mom to call 911. When I stepped outside behind him, I saw why. The top half of the shared fence had been pushed inward. Not broken all the way down. Just bent enough for a grown man to climb over. And in the dirt below it, right near my sister's window, there was a folding lawn chair facing the house. Whoever had put it there had been sitting in our yard, watching. The police came and actually took things seriously this time. They searched Trent's yard and his garage. In the garage, they found binoculars, women's clothing that didn't belong to anyone in his family, and a cheap digital camera. The camera had hundreds of photos. Not just of us. Of other neighbors too. Photos through windows. Photos over fences. Photos taken at night. There were a lot of pictures of my sister. The worst part, though, was a short video clip. It showed the inside of our backyard at night from very close to the house. He had been crouched right outside the sliding glass door while we were inside watching TV. In the reflection, you could see me and my sister laughing at something on screen, completely unaware that someone was inches away from the glass, filming us. Trent got arrested. You'd think that would be the end of the story. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, after he'd already been taken away, my sister woke up screaming. We all ran into her room. The note was on her pillow. A fresh one. 3 words. "Nice seeing you." The police said maybe Trent had hidden it earlier, and we just missed it. Maybe. But her window was locked that night. And on the outside sill, there were muddy fingerprints leading down toward the yard. When I was a kid, my family lived next door to a woman named Carol. This was in New Jersey, in a split-level neighborhood where everybody knew each other just enough to be polite, but not enough to really be close. Carol lived alone in the house on our right. She was probably in her late 60s, always wore oversized sweaters, and drove an old blue sedan with one dented door. If you met her once, you'd probably describe her as harmless. The problem was, she knew way too much. At first it seemed almost funny. She would say things like, Your husband got home late yesterday. To my mom, even though there was no reason for her to know that unless she had been watching. Or she'd mentioned that I missed the school bus and got driven in, which she would have had to notice from her front window. My parents laughed it off for a while. Carol was lonely. That was the explanation. Then she started bringing up things she couldn't have casually seen. One evening she told my mom, "I hope your son's fever is better." I had been sick that week, but the curtains had been closed and nobody had told her. Another time, she asked my dad if he ever found the missing checkbook. The checkbook had gone missing from the kitchen drawer the day before. My dad stared at her and said, "How do you know about that?" She smiled and said, "Oh, I just had a feeling." That's when my parents stopped finding it funny. My room was on the second floor facing the side yard between our houses. Carol's upstairs bathroom window lined up with mine. Most of the time the blinds in that bathroom stayed shut, but sometimes late at night I'd glance over and see a thin strip open just enough for someone to look through. I told my mom about it. She told me not to look back. That sounds dramatic now, but I understood what she meant. She didn't want me engaging with whatever was going on. Things got worse after my dad installed a new motion light in our side yard. The very first night it turned on, around midnight, my dad looked outside and saw Carol standing in her bathrobe near the fence. Just standing there, staring up at our house. When he opened the door and asked if she needed help, she turned and walked back inside without a word. The next morning, the motion light was smashed. The bulb had been unscrewed and crushed on the driveway. That same week, my mom started finding little objects moved around inside the house. Not stolen. Just moved. A pair of scissors left on the dining table. The TV remote in the bathroom cabinet. A framed family photo turned face down on a shelf. At first she blamed me. Then my dad. Then she admitted none of us could explain it. One afternoon I came home from school early because of a half day. My parents were both still at work. I unlocked the front door and immediately noticed the house felt wrong. It's hard to explain that feeling if you've never had it. Everything looked normal, but the silence felt occupied, like I had stepped into a place where somebody had just been. I called out for my mom out of habit, even though I knew she wasn't there. No answer. Then I heard a soft creak upstairs. I dropped my backpack. Every hair on my arm stood up. I slowly backed out of the house, got to the neighbor across the street, and called my mom from there. She called the police. When the police searched the house, they didn't find anybody. But they did find muddy prints on the carpet in the hallway upstairs. Small shoe prints. Not mine. Not my dad's. Not my mom's. The back door had been unlocked from the inside. And in my parents' bedroom, the closet door was open. Nothing was taken. A few days later, my dad added extra locks and one of those little chimes that beep when a door opens. That should have fixed things. It didn't. Because a week after that, my mom woke up at 3 a.m. because she heard the beeping alarm downstairs. Just once. The kind of quick chirp the door made when it opened and shut. My dad checked the house. Everything was locked. No windows open. No signs of entry. But on the kitchen table was a single teacup from Carol's house. We recognized it because she had served coffee in matching cups when my parents visited months earlier. My dad finally went to the police with everything, including the weird comments, the prints, the broken light, and the teacup. The police talked to Carol, but without real evidence there wasn't much they could do. Then my mom found the crawlspace door. There was a small square access panel in the back of my parents' closet, hidden behind hanging clothes. We had lived there for years and barely thought about it. It led to a narrow, unfinished space between the split levels of the house. The panel was open by a few inches. My dad got a flashlight and looked inside. He went pale. There were blankets in there. A flashlight. Empty water bottles. Crackers. And a stack of notepads. The police came immediately this time. The crawl space was dusty except for one clear path where someone had been moving in and out. It connected, through a bizarre gap behind the wall insulation, to the shared attic line that ran over toward Carol's house. Apparently the original contractor had left an unfinished pass-through decades earlier, and nobody ever sealed it off. Carol had been entering our house from above. She had been in the crawl space long enough to store food there. The notepads were full of writing. Pages and pages of notes about our family. What time my dad left for work. How often my mom called her sister. What I packed for school lunch. When we argued. When we laughed. What rooms we used the most. One line still sticks with me. They sound happiest when they think nobody hears them. The police went to arrest Carol that same evening. But she was gone. Her car was still in the driveway. Her purse was in the kitchen. The TV was on. But there was nobody in the house. They searched for hours and eventually found the back cellar door open. She had disappeared into the woods behind the neighborhood. They caught her 2 days later in an abandoned shed near a creek. I wish that were the end of it. Years later, after my parents had already sold the house, the new owners contacted them through the realtor. They were renovating the upstairs bathroom and found something sealed inside the wall. It was an envelope. Inside were 3 photographs of my family sleeping. All taken from inside our bedrooms. And on the back of one photo, in tiny careful handwriting, it said, "You never noticed when I was closest." In college, I rented the upstairs floor of an old duplex in Ohio with my friend Marcus. It was the kind of place that definitely should have been condemned but somehow kept getting rented anyway. The floors were uneven, the pipes knocked in the walls, and every room had that dusty old house smell that never really went away no matter how much you cleaned. The downstairs unit was empty when we moved in. About a month later, someone rented it. We never got his full name. The landlord just called him Ray. Ray was around 30, maybe a little older, thin with greasy hair and dark circles under his eyes. He barely spoke. The only real interaction I had with him at first was when we both reached the front porch at the same time and he muttered, "After midnight, don't use the basement stairs." I thought he was joking. He wasn't smiling. I said, "Why?" He stared at me for a second too long and said, "Because I hear someone on them." Then he went inside. The duplex had a shared basement with separate storage sections divided by wire fencing. There were 2 stairways leading down, one from our kitchen and one from his hallway. The landlord had told us not to keep valuables down there because the locks were old and sort of pointless. We mostly used it for laundry. The first weird thing happened when Marcus went down at around 1 in the morning because he forgot to switch his clothes into the dryer. He came back up less than 30 seconds later looking freaked out. He said, "There's somebody down there." I asked what he meant. He said he heard slow footsteps on the concrete and saw a light moving near the far wall, like someone holding a flashlight low to the ground. We assumed it was Ray. But when Marcus knocked on Ray's door a few minutes later to ask if he was in the basement, there was no answer. The next day, I saw Ray on the porch and asked if he'd been downstairs the night before. He said, "No. I told you not to use the stairs after midnight." That answer annoyed me more than scared me. I figured he was messing with us. A week later, I was doing laundry around 11:30 at night. I remember it clearly because I was studying for a brutal economics exam and just wanted to finish one normal chore before going back to panic. I carried the basket down the basement stairs, hit the pull chain for the light, and immediately smelled something rotten. Not like garbage. More like damp earth and spoiled meat. I almost went right back upstairs, but I told myself old basements just smell bad sometimes. I loaded the washer and was about to leave when I heard a noise from the far end of the basement. A soft dragging sound. Then a faint thud. I turned and looked through the rows of support beams and storage junk. The basement was divided into pockets of darkness even with the overhead bulb on. There were places where light just didn't seem to reach. That's when I saw it. A second light. Much dimmer. Moving behind the wire fence section that belonged to the downstairs unit. I called out, "Ray?" The little light stopped. No answer. Then it moved again, lower this time, almost at floor level, and slipped behind an old water heater. I left immediately. Marcus and I started timing our laundry so we never had to go down there at night. But weird things kept happening. Boxes in our storage area were moved around. A duffel bag we kept near the back was unzipped. One of Marcus's old shoes disappeared, then showed up 3 days later in the hallway outside our apartment door, muddy and wet. We accused Ray. He denied everything. He looked more exhausted every day. He started covering his downstairs windows with blankets, and at odd hours of the night we'd hear him hammering something into the walls. Then one Friday, the police showed up at the duplex. Apparently someone from 2 streets over had reported hearing screaming from the basement the night before. The officers searched both units and the basement. They didn't find anything obvious, but they asked all of us a lot of questions. Ray kept saying the same thing over and over. "It isn't me. I hear him too." After the police left, Marcus said we should move out. I agreed, but our lease still had months left. The real turning point came when the basement light started turning on by itself. Our kitchen had a tiny window in the door leading down to the basement stairs. Late at night, when the apartment was dark, you could tell whether the basement light was on by the glow under the door. More than once, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I'd wake up for no reason and see that glow. I'd stand in the kitchen, staring at it, trying to decide whether I was imagining it. Then I'd hear slow steps on the basement stairs. Not coming up. Not going down. Just one step. Then another. Then silence. I never opened that door when it happened. One night Marcus did. He's braver than me, or maybe just more impulsive. We were both in the kitchen around 1:40 a.m. because neither of us could sleep. The basement light glow appeared under the door again, and after about 20 seconds we heard the steps. Marcus whispered, "Screw this," and yanked the door open. The basement stairway was empty. The light below was on. And from somewhere in the darkness at the bottom, we heard a man's voice say, very clearly, "Close it." Not loud. Not angry. Just calm. Marcus slammed the door so hard one of the glass panes rattled loose. We called the landlord. He didn't answer. We called the police. They arrived about 20 minutes later. This time they searched the basement more carefully. One of the officers noticed the back wall and Ray's storage section had fresh plaster patches. They pulled some shelving aside and found a narrow opening that had been covered up. Behind it was a crawl space just tall enough for a person to crouch through. It ran under part of the neighboring property, an abandoned house that had burned years earlier and never been fully rebuilt. Inside the crawl space, police found bedding, food wrappers, candles, stolen mail, and a portable battery lamp. Someone had absolutely been living in there. But what really made it horrifying was what else they found. Photographs. Dozens of them. Not professionally taken. More like rush snapshots. Ray sleeping on his couch. Marcus carrying laundry. Me standing at the top of the basement stairs. There were also audio recordings on a cheap digital recorder. Mostly just breathing, footsteps, and long stretches of silence. But in one clip, you could hear Ray downstairs saying, "Please leave me alone," and a second voice answering from very close by, "I live here too." The police believed a drifter had been using the crawl space for months, maybe longer, slipping into the basement through the abandoned property and hiding whenever anyone came down. They searched the area that night but didn't find him. Ray moved out the next day without telling anyone. Just gone. Marcus and I stayed one more week at a motel until we could break the lease. Before we left for good, I went back one afternoon with the landlord to get the last of our things. The basement light was on. The landlord swore he hadn't been down there. Neither had I. We walked down together. Nothing seemed out of place. Then I noticed fresh mud on the third step from the bottom. One footprint. Barefoot. Wet. Leading upward. When I was 12, my family moved into a neighborhood in northern Illinois that looked almost too perfect. Every house had trimmed hedges, clean sidewalks, and the same style of mailbox. It was one of those places where, from the outside, everything looked safe. The house next to ours ruined that illusion almost immediately. It belonged to a family of 3, a father, a mother, and a son who looked around my age. We never got their last name because they didn't introduce themselves the way normal neighbors do. My mom baked brownies on our first weekend there and brought them over, but nobody answered the door even though a car was in the driveway. The strange thing was, we could hear movement inside. After that, we just called them the Curtin family, because every window in their house was covered all the time. Thick dark curtains. Day and night. Rain or shine. The only person we saw regularly was the father. He would leave for work every morning at exactly 7:10 a.m. He wore a black coat, carried the same brown briefcase, and never looked toward our house. Every evening at 6:03, he came back. Same coat. Same expression. Same routine. The mother was harder to spot. Sometimes we'd see her in the backyard hanging laundry, but even that was strange because she would always stop and go back inside the second anyone looked her way. The son was the weirdest part. I only saw him twice in the first month. Once standing in the upstairs window behind the curtain, staring out through a thin opening. And once in the backyard at dusk. He looked pale, skinny, and almost expressionless. When I gave him a small wave, he stepped backward into the dark part of the yard and disappeared behind the house. I wanted to be friends with him because there weren't many kids on the street, but my parents said to leave them alone. At night, I started hearing sounds through my bedroom wall, which faced their house. Sometimes it sounded like furniture dragging. Sometimes muffled shouting. Once, around midnight, I heard what I thought was a child crying. I told my mom, and she said maybe they were just having family problems. She didn't want to interfere. Then I found the messages. Our side yards were separated by a chain-link fence covered in vines. One afternoon, while chasing a baseball, I noticed a folded piece of notebook paper stuck in the fence. It had one sentence written on it. "Can you hear us too?" I assumed it was from the boy next door. I wrote back on another piece of paper. "Hear what?" The next day there was a reply. "At night. In the walls." That response scared me, but in a weird way it also made me more curious than afraid. It felt like the start of some secret friendship. I wrote back asking his name. The answer came the next evening. "Don't say my name outside." After that, we passed a few more notes through the fence. He told me his father didn't like him talking to neighbors. He said the house was bad after dark. He said there were places in the house he wasn't allowed to go, especially the basement. I asked if he was serious or just messing with me. He replied, "Something knocks from the other side of the wall in my room. My dad says to ignore it." A couple nights later, I woke up around 2 a.m. to tapping on my bedroom window. I sat up, terrified. The tapping came again, 3 quick taps, then silence. I looked toward the window and saw a shape outside. It was the boy from next door. He was standing in our side yard in his socks and pajamas, looking panicked. I opened the window just a crack and whispered, "What are you doing?" He said, "Don't turn on the light." His voice was shaking. I asked what was wrong. He looked back toward his house and said, "He let it out." To this day I remember how serious he looked when he said that. I asked, "Who?" He said, "My dad." Then he ran. Not back to his house. Around the front, toward the street. I woke my parents immediately. My dad went outside with a flashlight, while my mom called 911 because by then we could hear screaming next door. Real screaming. The kind that makes your blood go cold because you know it isn't a joke. Police cars arrived fast. I watched from the upstairs hallway while officers went into the Curtin family's house. An ambulance came a few minutes later. Then another police car. Nobody told us anything that night. The next morning, our street was full of neighbors pretending not to stare. The father was taken away in handcuffs. The mother left in the ambulance. The boy was nowhere to be seen. Over the next week, bits of the story spread around the neighborhood. Apparently the father had built a hidden room in the basement behind shelving. Not for storage. For confinement. The police never publicly said exactly who or what had been kept there, but they found restraints, old blood stains, and evidence that someone had been living in that room for a long time. Some neighbors claimed the father had kidnapped someone years earlier. Others said it was a relative with severe mental illness that he had hidden from everyone. Nobody knew for sure. The boy was placed with relatives. Months later, after the house was empty, a renovation crew came to fix water damage and remove parts of the basement wall. That's when they found another thing hidden in the insulation between our houses. A stack of notes. Not from the boy to me. Older notes. All in different handwriting. Some were barely readable, but one line was repeated on several pages. "We can hear you next door. Please help us." My parents never told me this part until I was an adult, but one of the officers later said the basement room looked old enough that it may have been used by more than one person over the years. That house was torn down eventually. Before they demolished it, the workers removed the upstairs curtains. Behind one of them, scratched into the glass from the inside, were the words, "He hears through the walls." When I was 23, I rented a tiny guest house behind a larger property in rural Georgia. It was cheap because it was isolated and technically not zoned correctly as a separate residence. I didn't care. I was broke, between jobs, and just needed a place to stay for a few months. The main house on the property was empty, but beyond the tree line to the west there was another home maybe 100 yards away. That was my only real neighbor. His name was Dale. He was one of those guys who seemed friendly until you spent more than 2 minutes around him. Thick beard, sunburned face, always chewing something, always smiling at the wrong time. He introduced himself the day after I moved in and said, "If you see lights in the woods at night, don't worry about it. I burn trash late." That felt like a weird thing to say unprompted. Over the next few weeks, I noticed he spent a lot of time in his backyard near a large fire pit. Sometimes the fires went on for hours. The smoke smelled awful, way worse than normal burned wood or garbage. Sweet and rotten at the same time. At night, the woods between our homes would glow orange through the trees. One evening, I was taking my trash to the bin when I heard him yelling. Not angry yelling, more like talking loudly to someone I couldn't see. I paused near the edge of the yard and listened. He said, "I told you to stay down there." Then silence. Then he laughed. I went back inside and locked the door. A few days later, I met a local gas station clerk who asked where I was staying. When I described the area, his expression changed and he said, "Near Dale's place? Don't go walking out there after dark." I asked why. He shrugged and said, "Animals go missing." That obviously could have meant anything in a rural area, but it still got under my skin. The next incident happened around midnight. I was half asleep when I heard pounding on my door. I grabbed my phone and looked through the peephole. Dale was standing outside, breathing hard. I opened the door just enough to keep the chain latched and asked what was wrong. He said, "You seen a girl around here?" Everything in me went cold. I said, "No." He looked over my shoulder into the guest house, then leaned closer to the crack in the door and asked, "You sure?" His eyes looked wild. Not drunk exactly. More like panicked. I said, "I haven't seen anyone." He stood there for another second, then smiled suddenly and said, "Must have been a deer." Then he walked back into the dark. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I found muddy footprints around the guest house. They circled the windows. I called the property owner and asked if I could leave early. He said I'd lose my deposit unless there was a real emergency. I didn't have enough money to argue, so I stayed. 2 nights later, I heard crying outside. Very faint. At first I thought maybe it was an animal, but then it happened again, and this time it sounded unmistakably human. A woman crying. I turned off every light and went to the back window, peeking through a slit in the curtain. There was movement near the tree line. A pale shape low to the ground, stumbling. Then I saw Dale's flashlight beam sweep across the woods. The crying stopped instantly. I should have called the police right then. I know that. Instead, I froze. There's this awful helpless feeling when you think you might be witnessing something horrible, but you're also terrified that if you act too soon, the person causing it will know it was you. The next day, I drove into town and anonymously reported suspicious activity at his property. Nothing seemed to happen. That same night, Dale invited me over for a beer. I almost said no, but I was scared that refusing would make things worse. So I went, telling myself I'd stay for 5 minutes. His house smelled like smoke and bleach. Inside, Everything was weirdly bare. No family photos. No decorations. Just old furniture and a TV playing with the volume low. He led me into the backyard. The fire pit was already burning. He handed me a drink and started talking about random things: weather, hunting, property taxes, like we were old friends. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "People always think the woods hide things." I didn't know what to say. He poked at the fire with a metal rod and continued, "Truth is, the ground's better." I laughed nervously because I thought maybe he was making some twisted joke. Then he looked straight at me and said, "You ever dig on this land?" I said no. He nodded like that answer mattered to him. As I was leaving, I noticed a fresh patch of turned dirt near the edge of his yard. Too rectangular to ignore. Maybe 6 feet long. I called the police again, this time not anonymously. They came the next afternoon, while I was at the guest house pretending not to watch. Dale talked to them calmly for almost 15 minutes. They looked around, but I don't think they searched deeply enough. Eventually they left. That night, someone banged on my bedroom window so hard I thought it would break. I rolled off the bed and hit the floor. Dale's voice came through the glass. "You called them." I didn't move. He banged again. Then silence. Then slow footsteps around the side of the guest house. I stayed on the floor with a knife in my hand until sunrise. The next morning, my car tires were slashed. That finally pushed the property owner to care. He came out with his brother, both armed, and confronted Dale while I packed my stuff. There was shouting, a lot of swearing, and then the police came again. This time they searched with a warrant. Near the fresh patch of dirt, they found animal bones. A lot of them. But deeper down, they found something else. A metal bracelet attached to a human wrist bone. The investigation got bigger after that. Detectives taped off property, forensic tents. I left town before most of it concluded, but I followed the story online later. They eventually connected Dale to a missing woman from a nearby county. What still bothers me is something I learned months after. The detectives believed someone else had been on his property very recently, possibly alive, because they found a hidden storm shelter in the woods with food wrappers and a torn piece of women's clothing. But it was empty by the time they opened it. The crying I heard that night? Maybe I imagined it. Or maybe someone heard the police coming later and ran deeper into the woods. Sometimes I think about the way Dale asked if I had seen a girl. Not a woman. A girl. And I wonder whether the person they found in the ground was the only one who didn't get away. The creepiest neighbor I ever had wasn't next door in a house. He lived across the hall from me in a third-floor apartment in a building outside Chicago. I moved there in my late 20s. It was one of those cheap old brick buildings with long dim hallways, buzzing fluorescent lights, and walls thin enough that you could hear a sneeze from 2 apartments away. The unit across from mine was occupied by a guy named Nolan. He was maybe mid-30s, soft-spoken, always polite in a strangely rehearsed way. If we passed in the hallway, he'd smile and say, "Evening," no matter what time of day it was. I didn't think much of him at first. Then I started noticing he always seemed to know when I was coming home. No matter how random the time was, after work, after groceries, after midnight on a weekend, his door would crack open a minute or 2 later. Not all the way. Just enough for him to peek out. The first time I really got unnerved was when I came home from visiting my sister. I had been gone all weekend. As I unlocked my apartment, Nolan opened his door and said, Nice seeing you back. 2 nights away, right? I stared at him. He smiled like he made harmless small talk. I asked how he knew that. He shrugged and said, "You're welcome." Matt was straight the whole time. That answer was weird enough on its own, but then he added, "You should really leave a lamp on when you travel." After that, I started paying attention. I realized his apartment was always completely quiet during the day, but at night I'd hear things through the hall. Not TV. Not music. Just low mechanical sounds, like reels turning or static clicking on and off. Then I found the first thing outside my door. A photograph. It was black and white, printed on glossy paper. It showed my apartment door from the far end of the hallway. On the back, written in neat block letters, were the words, "You look tired lately." I wanted to tell myself it was a prank. I brought it to the building manager, but he just frowned and said maybe a kid got into the building somehow. There were no security cameras on our floor. I started spending more nights at my boyfriend's place after that. One evening, when I returned after being gone for 2 days, Nolan was waiting in the hall with a grocery bag. He smiled and said, "You changed shampoo?" I actually felt sick. He pointed vaguely toward my door and said, "I can smell it when the steam comes out after your shower." I said, "Don't talk to me." His smile faded, but only a little. That night I checked every lock twice. At around 3 a.m., I woke up because I heard something metallic at my front door. A tiny scraping sound. Then another. I sat up in bed and listened. It sounded exactly like someone gently testing keys against a lock. I called the police while standing silently in my bedroom. By the time they arrived, there was nobody in the hallway. But on the floor outside my door, they found 3 bent bobby pins and a small flathead screwdriver. The police spoke with Nolan. He denied everything. The next day, he acted completely normal. Passed me in the hall and said, "Looks like somebody's giving you trouble." That was the moment I knew it was him. I bought a door camera and installed it inside my apartment, pointing at the entrance. The first 2 nights, nothing happened. On the 3rd night, I got a motion alert at 2:11 a.m. I watched the clip with my heart pounding. My doorknob turned slowly, then stopped. A second later, a piece of paper slid underneath the door. After a long pause, shadowy feet remained visible in the gap for nearly a full minute before finally moving away. I waited until morning to pick up the paper. It was another photo. This one was of me sleeping. Not recently, I could tell by the old comforter I used to have, but definitely taken inside a bedroom. My first thought was that it had to be from an ex or from social media somehow, but I had never posted photos like that. When I showed it to the police, they asked if anyone besides me had access to old phones or cloud backups. I couldn't think straight enough to answer. That evening I went to stay with my boyfriend again. When I came back with him the next day to grab clothes, my apartment smelled wrong. Warm. Stale. Like someone had been inside with the windows shut. Nothing looked stolen. But in the bathroom trash, under tissues and cotton pads, was a used coffee cup that wasn't mine. My boyfriend wanted to confront Nolan immediately. I stopped him and called the police instead. This time, officers searched Nolan's apartment with the building manager present after they got enough cause from the repeated incidents. What they found was horrifying. His living room had almost no furniture except for a folding chair facing the wall. On the wall were dozens of photographs. Not just of me. Of people throughout the building. Tenants carrying laundry. Opening doors. sleeping through uncovered windows, standing in kitchen light late at night. There were also handwritten logs, dates, times, patterns, who left for work when, who fought with partners, who drank, who cried, which apartments had pets, which locks were old. And in a closet they found a ring of copied keys labeled with apartment numbers, mine included. The police also found a vent grate in Nolan's bedroom that had been removed and reattached many times. The duct space behind it led to an old maintenance shaft between the walls. That was how he moved. Not into every apartment completely, but close enough to listen, watch, and sometimes reach places no one expected. He was arrested. The building manager changed all the locks, and I moved out 2 weeks later anyway. I tried to forget about it. Then, months later, I got a package with no return address. Inside was a cassette tape. No note. No explanation. I don't even own a cassette player, but my dad does. So I took it to him, and we listened together in his garage. It was a recording of hallway noise in my old building. Footsteps. Doors opening and closing. The buzz of fluorescent lights. Then my own voice, right outside my old apartment, saying on the phone, "I think he's gone." After that there was a soft laugh. Then Nolan's voice, whispering very close to the microphone. I never lived across the hall. The police listened to it later and told me he was likely trying to scare me from jail or through someone he knew. Maybe that's true. But when I looked up the tenant history for the building out of paranoia, apartment 3B, the one across from me, had been listed as vacant for the first 3 months I lived there. And those were the same 3 months when I remember passing Nolan in the hallway the most. Which story scared you the most? Comment below and subscribe for more true horror stories. If you want to share your story with us, send us at belladarktales@gmail.com.